All right, we'll begin so that we stay on some time. Welcome. Thank you for coming. I know it's past the last session and right after lunch, and we're really happy to have some of you here. So we're going to share with you a little bit about leadership in Africa today and try to take you through some of the work that we've both been doing, and hopefully you'll have some good questions for us. We can have some good discussion at the end. We're going to try to break up our time, and we'll both take about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have about 20 minutes of discussion and questions from there. Thank you for coming. My name is Whitney McIntyre-Miller. I am an assistant professor of organizational leadership at Northern Kentucky University. I'm presenting a piece of my doctoral research. I actually just finished. Great. So thank you. So it's nice to be done. And now, of course, there's lots of things to be done in the future, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But my presentation today is Transforming Local Leadership to Develop Communities for the Future in Post-Conflict Sierra Leone. So I always tend to ask, how many folks saw the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, Blood Diamond? Wow. All right, great. Unfortunately, that's most people's familiarity with Sierra Leone. I'll take it as I can get it, I guess. But here's some statistics that you can read a little bit as I'm talking about Sierra Leone. It's a country on the western coast of Africa. And Sierra Leone was colonized by the British and received its independence in the 1960s, like much of Africa as well. You'll see that the population at the time of the war, which we'll talk about, the population was 4.7 million. At this point in time, these statistics were a little old now, but there was a little over 6 million people who live in the country. So those of you who are familiar with the film know that Sierra Leone had a conflict, a 11-year conflict from 1991 to 2002. And in that time, we saw about 4.7 million people, which we talked about, 50 to 70,000 were killed, and about 2.6 million were displaced, either internally displaced or displaced in other parts of Africa, and in addition, some folks came to other countries around the world as well. And so really the roots of the conflict are deep and really intense to talk about, and we could do that for an entire period, but the gist of what happened in the conflict was there was issues of control of resources, especially diamonds, hence the movie that you saw, and the issue of government control of those resources and the funding of those resources, so not going back to the people. There were issues of power struggles in the local and national government, and there was the disenchantment of youth. And youth were really involved in the communities for a while, but once the power structure became such that they felt they could not get ahead in their communities, the youth became disenchanted and ultimately joined the rebel forces that came in from Liberia, the neighboring country, and oftentimes made up a lot of the soldiers of the war. And so we had all these elements working against folks in Sierra Leone at the time of the Peace Accords in 2002. So what really happened in the war was that we saw there were attacks on communities by the rebel soldiers. Like I said, they came in from the east in Liberia, and we saw a lot of fleeing of people, burning and looting of houses, and primarily things that a lot of people, unfortunately, most commonly heard about were the amputations, which was one of the ways of really more control and power over people as opposed to a necessary physical violence that was happening. Of course, physical violence was what happened. The involvement of the international community came at various stages during the war, and finally they were able to create a formal peace agreement, move the rebel forces to the northern area of the country, which is actually where I did my study, and they were able to create a cessation of violence and a formal peace agreement. And so at that point in time, which was in 2002, really communities were looking at how do we move forward from here. Now that we've got this conflict, we're emerging from this conflict, and we need to find a future that's embedded in peace, and how do we do that? And so really this research that I did was actually looking at a larger spectrum of community development in communities in Sierra Leone, and what were the factors that really helped influence community development across different lines. Now, one of the things I'm focusing on here is the role of leadership. We are at a leadership association, so I think it's the only purpose that we focus on leadership for here. And so a piece of the study was actually looking at local traditional leadership. And while the study looked broadly at traditional and Western mechanisms for development in these countries, one of the things that really remained salient was actually the role of local leadership in the transformation of those communities. And we saw that there were really two things happening. One, there was the role of the traditional community chiefs and how their role had changed and had developed to work towards community development. and also this, what I'm calling co-gendered organizational leadership, which is a new model of leadership that we saw developing in these communities after conflict. So we're going to talk about both of those types of leadership today. So a quick overview of the study. It was a grounded theory design. I did quite extensive lit review to find there was not a lot of lit out there to review. So we found that the grounded theory methodology would be the best, as we could ensure that themes and data would emerge from the interviews that were conducted. I was in Sierra Leone in the northern parts of the country, in Mungi and Makeni, for 5 weeks. So what I did was I did in-depth qualitative interviews, 14 individuals in each community. I also did participant observations. I was involved in ceremonies and conversations and meetings and other sort of community happenings to get a feel for what was going on in these communities and how they were developing after conflict. So with extensive journaling, coded transcripts, etc., I was able to really put together some themes around what was happening in the communities around leadership and how leadership was really working to transform those communities ahead and moving forward. So I just want to give you a little bit of the literature that's out there. There is some. I looked really in terms of leadership at 3 categories: leadership for community change, African traditions of leadership, and then the literature that exists on leadership for community change in Sierra Leone. And as you can imagine, it got smaller and smaller and smaller as we went. So some of the general themes for leadership for community change that were important were that communities tended to choose existing leaders after a conflict or after a disaster. But there was also some folks who saw benefits of choosing new leaders. And so that was definitely a debate in the literature that needed to be examined. And that leaders for change need to understand community conflict or community context and to establish trust. So those are 2 major lessons that were learned from some of the community literature that was out there. For looking at traditional African thoughts on leadership, there were 2 sort of things that really was another debate in the literature. There's the thought of African leaders as big men requiring accolades and being what we would think of in our brains as a chief, and what a chief might do, being in charge of the folks in the village and being the one on top, making all the decision-making, etc. And the other thing that juxtaposed that was the African traditional leaders as being humanistic. Interesting. I don't know what it means that humanistic got put in the 12-point font in addition with there's some sort of meaning there that we'll have to unpack and figure out what it is. But the other thought is that the leaders are more humanistic. The concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, is another concept that's looked at. And so what really that varied down to is African leaders for community change, not necessarily Sierra Leone, but African leaders is kind of a general survey, was that leadership needs to be relational to the community, and that there really was an extensive debate in both bodies of literature about new versus old leadership. Do we bring in the people who were there before and move them forward, or do we give somebody new who wasn't involved in what was happening a chance? And so what we found for community change in Sierra Leone is that it was interesting that most communities returned to the existing leadership with the traditional chiefs. And so that was found both in literature and while I was there as well. So that you know, the traditional chiefs were around prior to colonization, and there were traditional structures that involved the elders of the community. When the British came to colonize, they really made those structures much more what we would consider to be Western in style and look and appearance, and the chiefs were given the role of collecting the taxes and doing the things that the British couldn't get to the communities to do because they didn't have the people and the manpower and the access to do that. So the chiefs were really used as a piece of the British hierarchy system in Sierra Leone. And so that helped contribute to the role of the chief in the conflict. So after they gained independence, there was this disconnect between the traditional role of the chief prior to colonization and what was happening with the hierarchical Western structures that were in place. We saw, unfortunately, a lot of corruption among the chiefs. We saw chiefs hoarding resources and using the taxes for their own good as opposed to community good. We saw youth that felt they could never really get ahead in their communities, and so they were fleeing to the big cities or trying to find a way to really have a say in what was happening in their communities and in the government, and they felt that they really weren't being able to do that. So the role of the chief played an important piece in there in the conflict. The other thing that we saw in the literature is that a lot of folks talked about the benefit of having a sense of security upon your return. So as we said, 2.7, almost half of people who lived in Sierra Leone during the conflict fled at some point in time or another, either to other communities within Sierra Leone, neighboring countries, or countries abroad. And so that's half of the folks are coming back in. And so a lot of people said that the chief was essential for them to feeling safe. If the chief had returned, when the community was okay, I'll be okay, I can return. And so then the key question of all that was in the literature about, can a chief really be held accountable? Again, if they're contributing to the problems that were caused, if people had been abroad and they'd seen other things that were happening in the world, and they came back to their communities, how can the chief, as the role the chief played before, still be accountable? So that was really kind of where the study was nestled in, looking at new versus old leadership, and can the chief really be a leader that helps transform communities for the future if they're so embedded in some of the horrible things of the past. And then the additional, which we found interesting, was there was very little specific research on pro-gendered leadership in Sierra Leone in the communities for community development. Of course, there's a wide body of literature on women's inclusion for development, and we'll talk a little bit about that next, is that the role of women in development, the importance of women in development. And also there's a fair amount of literature about the importance of African women being responsible for teaching cultural norms and being the ones to help bring the community together. And so we see that it makes sense, based on what literature is out there, that the women's role would increase because of these two factors. All right, so I want to just tell you a little bit about each. First, we're going to talk about the chieftaincy leadership. So historically, the chiefs are responsible for granting community rights, rights to land, rights to property, rights within the structural system, to tax collection to be used for the good of the community, for settling disputes within the community. And then after conflict, they were also responsible for ensuring community safety and security and for encouraging post-conflict returns. And like I said earlier, that if someone saw that their chief had returned home, or that someone who, as a chief was killed, someone who was in the elder structure had taken up the role of chief, that they felt more safe and secure to return. So the biggest challenge was how to be this and embody this in a way that doesn't return to the corruption that was seen before the war and the conflict. And we really found that there were three main transformations that happened in the chieftaincy to help move things forward as opposed to keeping them as they were. So the first, and two of these are actually really around the role of accountability, and that's accountability by the local people who came back to the community. It's accountability by national systems that were put in place and Western systems that were also put in place. And so really what we found is that the chiefs were held accountable for the role of community development. They made sure that the community was involved in what was happening, that there were meetings held, that people felt that they were included in the process, that the funds were used for things that the community felt were necessary. Some of the common projects you'll see in the two communities where I was were crops and fishing and palm wine production for agriculture, microcredit lending for small businesses, and by small businesses we mean very small, selling phone cards for cell phones and these sorts of things, selling fruits and vegetables. And then construction of community centers and markets for community space. It's a chance for people to come together in a safe area and really talk and think about rebuilding. But it's important to know, and you have to say that everything's not perfect, right? We're seeing that these transformations are happening, but there were still folks who felt really uninvolved in the community, and that they felt that because the chief was involved in politics as well, the chieftaincy structure is that the head chiefs are also in the parliament of the country, and that this connection between being in politics and being a traditional leader sometimes was a trouble for making sure that the people felt the resources were going where they needed to go. In addition, they were also held accountable for fairly resolving community disputes. So oftentimes when folks felt that their disputes could no longer be settled amongst the disputants, they would go to the chief, and the chief would help solve cases. Land and property cases were the most common, especially when people were coming back. People whose homes were there prior to the war, someone else was living in them. Like I said, the rebels were pushed into the north, and so a lot of folks who weren't there before were living in these houses. Also social issues, polygamy and promiscuity were actually really widely talked about by most of my participants as issues that the chiefs would help settle. Dishonesty, issues of corruption as well, we still saw them in the community. And overall, the majority of my participants felt that the chiefs were fair, although there were some who believed that the chiefs still played favorites in decision-making. But one of the things that's important to note is that the national structure that was put in place made there accountability. If you don't like how the chief settles your case, you can take it to a national court and to a local court, and then that makes sure that the chief is fair, because if all of his cases are going to court, it gives him a bad reputation and being unfair in settling these disputes. And it was really expensive for both the chief and for the disputants. So it was best to work out those disputes within the community, if at all possible. And finally, the third piece for the chieftaincy leadership is that for the first time, Sierra Leone saw women becoming chiefs. And this had not happened in the country prior to this, to the end of the conflict. Now, in the northern regions where I was, there were still no female chiefs. But in the southern region, you saw that there was a movement to have more female chiefs elected into the office. And oftentimes people said that the role of women were largely limited. A quote from one of my participants said that the women were often subject of backyard activities. And that's how we described the role of women in caring for the children and for preparing the food and these sorts of things. And after the war, the value of women was seen as increasing, and they were brought more in to join the community. So they found that they were a contributing factor to development. And that leads me to my final leadership point, which is creating co-gendered leadership. This was something that was found in the community organizations in the communities I visited, that there was a co-gendered leadership team that was put into place. If the president was male, the vice president was female. If the president was female, the vice president was male. And it was an interesting way for people to try to move forward, including women, in this piece of leadership in the community. Now, it didn't always work out as well as we would have liked. There was some bickering between who was really responsible for making things happen, whether it was the female president and the male vice president or vice versa. So I think when we see new ways of holding power, that sometimes there's a struggle in trying to figure out how to make those work effectively. But one of the things that was also seen was as soon as the women took roles in the community, that they also were taking other roles in the community. So as soon as women were brought forward and were involved in these community groups, there were more women running for office than had ever run before in these communities. And there were more women involved in women's-only groups as well as these co-gendered leadership styles. All right, so basically what we found from leadership based on this research was that the communities really showed that transforming local leadership would help move the communities forward. They were involving people in the development funds and projects. They were fairly solving disputes. They were involving women in the chieftaincy for the first time. And they were creating these new models of co-gendered leadership. So what does this mean for some of us? It means a lot for Sierra Leone, but for you, other than your experiences maybe going to Sierra Leone and embracing some of this leadership, some of the things that I think that we can learn from this is that leadership can adapt to changing community needs. Of course, it's not always easy, but if we can hold leaders accountable at the community level, at the national level, and at international organizations who are involved in the community, that leadership can change and can start to change. The shift in power dynamics can provide greater opportunities for individuals in communities. We saw that with the women. Inclusive leadership means also that maybe the women can be included in other facets of life because they're given valuable tasks at a time. That local leaders, when working with community leaders, can provide positive community development that really moves communities towards the future. And I think one of the most important things that this research has shown is that it may not be an and/or. Or do we use old leaders or do we use new leaders? And a lot of the literature has this debate of do we use old leaders or do we use new leaders? And really what this shows is that we might be able to do both. That we can use old leaders in new ways and we can use new leaders in new ways, and both of them can contribute to the overall fabric of the community and moving it forward. And because when we're talking about post-conflict issues, sometimes we can be a little depressed. But the Sierra Leoneans that I spoke with were rarely depressed. And their favorite thing to tell me is where there is life, there is hope. So I always like to end on that, and we can hope that that's true. Where there's life, there is hope. So I'm going to end here, and then We're going to have our next presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. So thank you.
I'm Eliane Belgero, and I'm a professor at McGill University. So to transition into the next step, I'll just give you some background that I gave to some of the people. Anybody was in grad last year? Okay. So I gave a presentation giving the background right now. In Rwanda, we have 56% women in parliament, and it's the highest level of women representation in parliament in the world. So if I compare Rwanda to Sierra Leone, in terms of the political structures at all levels, women have advanced tremendously. And now, really, the next step that I felt was important to look at is if we look at the most disenfranchised, so the poorest in the population, and the poorest in the population are usually women, and households that are led by women are poorer than households that are led by men, is how much of the presence of women leaders in government has translated into effective changes at the bottom. There's been enormous changes in terms of legal systems, in terms of frameworks to support women to move up. And now what we did with this research is look at what are the voices of rural women in Rwanda, and what do they have to say, and how does it compare to the leaders in their community. So what we used something called participatory visual methodology, or gender analysis, to look at how are the ways we can bring out Rwandan women's stories and see how they mesh with what their leaders are saying. So the structure I'm involved in is called FemStep. And FemStep comes from Femme in French, that means women, and Step means let's go step by step. And so the idea is how do we use rural girls and women's perspectives to engender poverty reduction strategies in Rwanda. And so FemStep has researchers at McGill University in Canada, as well as researchers in South Africa, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Congo, that have been involved in some of the research projects we've worked on. And so we've been funded by different structures from the Canadian government to do our research. And so the research activity, so FemStep has been involved in a symposium that was held at McGill on feminist visual methodologies for social action. And we've also done a training and international workshop in Rwanda. We've had a pilot study looking at the voices of women and girls in rural Rwanda. And from this, we've trained young Rwandan researchers, and they've created their own gender clubs within high schools and universities in Rwanda. And we plan to initiate a large study by the end of this year. And so what was interesting is when we held our training and workshop, we had researchers coming from different countries in Africa, as well as graduate students. And what was really interesting to me is when we were working on material, at the end of the day, the cleaners in the Kigali Institute of Education would come up and look at what we had done. And so it was seeing how what we were doing was bringing in people in the community, and that's why I felt it was important just to show this picture, to see the curiosity people had on, what's happening and what are we trying to generate here. And one of the things we developed was a documentary video that I may show 5 minutes. So if there are no questions at the end, I can show it this video. And I took this photo because, and what this video shows is some of the researchers that were trained in participatory audiovisual methodologies. They were sent into a market in Kigali, and they were asked they had ethical guidelines they needed to use. So they could only take close-up pictures if the person agreed to have the pictures taken, and if the person didn't agree, the only way they could take pictures was from far away where you couldn't recognize anybody. So it was really important to engage the people within the market, and if they refused, you couldn't take pictures. And it was really interesting that all the young students who went in, the people who were working in the market were really open to the idea of having them come in and talk to them. But the more senior the person who came into the market came to them to talk, they'd say, well, I want some money. So there was very interesting in terms of how you set up your research study to ensure that you actually have voluntary participation of subjects into the event. And it was very interesting for me because when we held this training session, I had just come from Montreal where I was involved in moderating a high-level panel discussion on microcredit in the world and looking at the largest microcredit institutions and what are they looking at and what are they finding. And interestingly, our students going into the market gave me the results that I've gotten from the large micro-institutions from the world. And I thought that's interesting, how going directly to the ground can give us a lot more information than we think is available to us. And so what was interesting is we had about 100 people come to the workshop itself, and the training involved about 30 people. And most of those were graduate students and researchers coming from Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, and learning, well, how do you use drawing, how do you use film, how do you use photography, and how do you get the subjects you're involved in to be the ones drawing and filming and taking the pictures. So it's not about really us going in and doing it. It's about having the subjects themselves express what they have to say through audiovisual means. And so in the workshop, we had several exercises, and some dealt with gender-based violence, violence against children, because Rwanda and Congo, for example, have gone through conflict. And it was interesting to see what was coming up in terms of the participants. Was it more war? Was it more voices coming from family situations? What was coming up? But also just looking at different exercises. We also had a forum theater where we gave people a theme and they said, okay, just you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, improv, and give us the subject and show us the context on how that is one of the challenges that women face in your community. And the depth of information that came from these different forms, whether it was drawing, whether it was photography, whether it was a film, or whether it was forum theater, all brought out different aspects of the culture that may not have been brought out if it was simple interviews. And the interaction from the theater, because you don't know what the other person is going to say, it's really something evolving and manifesting moment to moment. And that was really interesting because it brought out some subjects that could have been taboo, but were brought up in humorous and compassionate ways that allowed the public to say, I can feel that, and I've been through that. And so there was a way that the use of participatory methodologies allowed to get beyond the places where we censor ourselves. And what was great about the international workshop is we had people coming from the private sector, people coming from government, as well as from local and international NGOs. So having different voices that are involved in development come in and see what were the results from the training and see how they could be using them for their own work. One example I think of is a doctor from the health ministry who was in charge of maternal health. They were leading a program around premature babies and how fathers could get involved in the caring of premature babies and the importance of holding premature babies close to the body and how that increased the weight of the baby. And she realized that if, in the cases where this was used, if they were able to document the family, the increase in weight, and have a poster showing that, father holding the baby and the weight gain compared to other situations, that this would be a way for them to increase their campaign around the country in more effective ways. Because when you go into illiterate populations, you can read all the pamphlets you want. They're not going to be looking at them, but the visual speaks. And the visual can go through cultural barriers where well, no, the father isn't supposed to be carrying the baby. But when you see the changes that happen, well, that's something that engages you and makes you realize, well, maybe it's worth going beyond what I'm used to doing to get to this new space. And so in May, we had a first pilot study to look at the effectiveness of using one of the participatory methodologies, which is called photo voice, and it's really putting the cameras in the hands of the subject who wants to study and seeing what comes out of it. And in our case, we're working with rural women in Rwanda who are mostly illiterate. And so we wanted them to go out and give us an idea of what were their challenges and their solutions to agricultural issues they had. And at the same time, surveys were done with professionals in those same areas So half of them were elected officials, and half of them were extension workers in agriculture, and saying, here are some questions in terms of what you may think women's problems are. And so a comparative was done in terms of what the professionals were saying, and then looking at what the pictures of the women that they were taking said and see what were the discrepancies. And at the same time, we took in undergraduate students who were finishing at the Kigali Institute of Education, who were going to become teachers or looking into going to graduate schools. And we trained them to work with the women in Kinyarwanda so that we could be able to continue the studies and have them potentially start their own work, like the gender clubs we started in the high school. So this is a picture of, this is Kigali, this is Rwanda, and on one side is the Akagera National Park. So we looked at rural areas that were a little bit outside of Kigali. It takes about 3 hours to get to the national park. So this is probably about 45 minutes and about an hour and a half from Kigali in terms of the distance of the two areas, the Gahanga and the Ntebe in the Kayunga district. And so using this methodology, so going into their communities, it was interesting to see how the women were this was the first time they had a camera in their hands. And one of the things, because the research is funded by government institutions and the Farm of Canadian University, there were a lot of ethical issues we needed to run with the women before we could actually do the studies. So we had to make visual consent forms. And so then they could see through the visual consent forms whether, okay, this is what's going to happen, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then have them just put their thumb. And so we are able to conduct the studies within the ethical frameworks of our university. And the excitement they had in terms of saying, we're going to be taking pictures of what we're interested in. And so they were given the cameras and had 24 hours to go out and take pictures of what they saw as their issues and solutions to what they had. So this is just an example showing, she has a camera and she's taking a picture of one of her colleagues. And so you can see that she's hoeing the field and she has her baby on her back. So what they're highlighting here is the fact that she's mothering and she's being an agricultural producer at the same time. And so they're the ones who set up their pictures. So we had no say at all in terms of how they were going to be conducting their photography. And what we asked is for every picture to have one phrase that describes, what this picture represents. So in one case, it's cultivating is difficult work. And so she must bring her baby with her wherever she goes. If she has nobody she can leave the baby to. So we have to remember this is a post-conflict situation. A lot of people have lost extended family, and so there's added burdens in terms of what their family responsibilities are. And so they work all day in the field, and in this case, just to give the cultural context, she has some branches that she's going to be using to light up the fire to cook the dinner. She's carrying the products that she's collected from the field on her head, and she has her baby on her back. So she's saying, well, not only do I work all day, but I have all these other things I need to do with my time. The second picture was we need a lot more water to be able to be more productive. And these are things the experts usually think, farmers who are used to subsistence farmers aren't prepared to transform into productive commercial farming. And so this was really interesting to us because we realized that the women knew what they needed to become more productive commercial agricultural producers. And what they wanted is how do we access these tools? So that was something new because a lot of people will say in the agricultural research area that there's a resistance to go from subsistence farming to productive commercial farming. And so they wanted transportation tools to be able to take their crops to the market, and they wanted to be able to have better tools to do their weeding. So this shows that they had an interest in technological innovations that would help them be more effective in their daily work. And they wanted organic fertilizer, and they also wanted to be able to organize in communities, to be able to share in the tasks they had to do together. And so this was really interesting because they have so many solutions to their problem. They wanted to have more training, they wanted technical advice to support them, and they wanted access to credit that their husbands couldn't take away from them. So these were revelations in terms of their capacity to be able to move the communities forward. And when I compare to what you were talking about, old leadership, new leadership, is women have these spaces of innovation in themselves that have not been tapped up. And this is 50% of the population. So what will happen when we unleash all of that creativity and get it to work to advance the economy? And when we talk about micro-producers, yes, they're micro-producers. But if you have 4 million micro-producers going from $1 a day to $10 a day, well, that increases GDP by a major factor. And it's how do you integrate all of these together? So they wanted access to modern technology in terms of milking the cows. They wanted transportation to get their produce faster so it wouldn't spoil and getting it to the market. And then what we did is for each area where the women went out and took these pictures, is the pictures were printed and they had an exhibition where people in their community came to see what they had taken pictures of. And they were there for the first time saying, here's my picture. I am the artist, and here's what I've done, and here's what it represents. So this was a way for them to take ownership, to be able to tell their story of what they saw their issues were and the vision of where they wanted to go. And they were able to tell their peers as well as to the leaders in their communities. And this was important because our surveys were showing that the leaders in the communities thought, because there's been so much advance in Rwandan community, that women had access to technology, to productive tools, to banking, in the same way as the men had. And what the women were saying, no, we don't. So this was also helping the leaders, in terms of the gap of their reality of the citizens that they were presenting with the vision that the country has of Vision 2020 is bringing Rwanda by 2020 to a middle-class economy. So how do you do that when there's a gap between what the leaders think they know and the reality of what the poor citizens that need to bring up to create a middle-class economy to get there? And the faster we can fill this gap, the faster Rwanda can meet that 2020 goal. We only have 10 years left. So the research findings found that the solutions and priorities in terms of breaking down gender barriers were clear. Women knew exactly what they needed and how different it was from what their husbands required, and that the access they had wasn't as open. The barriers they had were greater than the men in their communities. And we realized that through Photo Voice, these exhibitions, we were able to bring experts in, as like in the international workshop where we brought in policymakers, where we brought in private sector. And, through images, not 50-page reports written by consultants from the World Bank. People would come and say, oh, this is what needs to be done. This is what they want. So if I bring it in this way, then things will be able to move faster. And so this was really important. And the most important part is the space of giving them voice to tell stories. And that they were able, in their own words, through the photography, through the audiovisual means, to realize that they had wealth of knowledge inside of them that they hadn't been able to share with others. So this was really empowering in terms of what we were able to do. So the next steps we're looking at in our research is to extend. We've started talking to the National Agricultural Research Institute. The director of the institute has been really excited about our preliminary findings and would like to work together so that the research and innovations they bring in correlate with what the women are asking for, and that the innovations can be brought in the way that will be most absorbed by the community. And also what we're interested in is having the voices of the girls and women not only extend our field trials, but have these voices go on to the leaders and have exhibits where leaders in Rwanda can have access to this information and see for themselves, well, how can they contribute to making this move forward? And so what we're working on right now is a follow-up grant that would look at prosperity building and innovation strategies for the bottom of the pyramid market. And it's looking at, well, what type of training programs would be important to bring in that will allow the leaders, the middle managers who are caught in between the large visions of the higher leadership in terms of government and business in Rwanda, and the reality of the port, how do they incorporate the vision and the reality into their leadership strategies, into their negotiation skills, so that they're able to serve the vision as well as the reality at the same time? So hopefully we'll get the grant submitted and get some funding next year, and maybe in London I'll give you some preliminary. So overall, what we're hoping is to enhance Rwanda's capacity to attain the Vision 2020 and have Rwanda be one of the African tigers that's going to be emerging and showing a new way of how Africa can move forward.
All right, so we've got right about 15 minutes, I believe, a little over, so we're both happy to take any questions you have.
Oh, you want to see the video? Maybe you can take the question.
Any questions while we're video searching? Yeah.
Just when you were describing the process in Sierra Leone, I wasn't quite clear whether who managed this change process. Was it the villages managed, for example? You said there had no rules about integrating women, and they had elections and all this kind of stuff. Was that kind of an outside organization supporting the villages, or was it just come from the leadership? They went back and decided to do that by themselves. Where did the impetus come from?
Both. The short answer is both. The election process for traditional leadership has been in place for generations. And so the process exists, and it is very complicated. And I would be honest to tell you that even I'm not sure I fully understand who gets elected and why and how, and it's a very long structure. But what happened is that for the first time, women were allowed to run for the position of chief in the community. And my understanding is that happened in its own impetus. I mean, we have to acknowledge that there was a huge Western influence in the country. And so we had lots of development groups that were coming from the United Nations, from one-on-one country aid groups, USAID, et cetera, that were coming into the country. And so, of course, we cannot say that they didn't have an influence on those structures. It's not possible. In fact, when I started my research, I really wanted to find communities in Sierra Leone that were least influenced by international and Western influences after the conflict, and it was very difficult to find. Most communities had one international organization or another involved in the process. And so likely there was, I can't say that there's not influence from outside forces that allow that to happen. But there wasn't a mandate, there wasn't a national or international mandate that said you had to include women in these processes. They were included on their own accord, but that influence was definitely there.
And the little NGOs directly facilitating the process in any kind of way. So it's kind of more
right.
Change in consciousness, because the war thing, we have to change things.
Absolutely. And that from everything, from the findings of my research and the readings in the literature, is a change of consciousness that happened, and it didn't happen altogether. It's still not 100%. It's not every woman is now included in some leadership role by any means. But there has been this gradual change in allowing women to become part of the process of the community at many levels, at the chieftaincy level in the south of the community and in the community organizations and other community leadership positions, even national and local government elected positions in the community that have shifted.
Yeah. Were you able to tap into other women leadership strategies? Sometimes market women are organized easily, sometimes women or family society.
There's actually a really interesting group of women called FAWE, the Forum for African Women Educationalists. I know you know them. They're all around Africa. There's a group that was formed for Sierra Leone, actually in Guinea, while a group of women had fled the country. And so they had heard about FAWE and the work that they were doing educating women and girls around Africa and created their own chapter. But it happened outside of Sierra Leone. It actually happened while these women were in a refugee camp together. And they brought that structure back to Sierra Leone, and they have FAWE chapters now throughout the country, and it's a really wonderful organization that is prosperous and doing really amazing work. And I was lucky to be able to work really closely with the women of FAWE who were doing the work in the communities as well, and they served as my hosts. The Forum for African Women Educationalists. They're actually headquartered in Nairobi, but there are branches all throughout Africa.
Yes.
I'm guessing Rwanda has one, I'm sure.
Really
Yeah. Yeah.
They do some specific research, for example, around girls and science, getting more girls into science programs. They do research around what keeps girls out of school and campaigns to get more girls in school. They do fundraisers to help girls get sanitary pads so they don't miss a week of school every month. So they're very active and very action-oriented. And they're very supported by the men. That's the most amazing thing about it, too. This is a women-led, women-run organization that has male support. And, in fact, the men actually make sure that they help progress the women in this because they're seeing this movement and the changes happening across communities based on a group that was created while people were in refugee camps. There was no education and people were stuck and they had nothing to do to further themselves while they were there, and they started this program, and it's just really taken off and done great things. The Mano River Union isn't as strong as Sierra Leone as some of the other countries. It's growing. There is talk in both communities. The Mano River Union was not mentioned at all in either of the communities I was in, although I do know that it's building in Sierra Leone, the larger communities of Sierra Leone, just not actually in the northern communities yet.
I work in Pakistan, there's some points, and in many places there's problems in parallel political structures. You organize the community and you have the civic elected representatives.
Sure.
When I first heard that the chief is actually also elected,
yes.
My question to you was, how does the problem of problematics? What comes up? Why is it complicated?
It's interesting because there's basically two sections of Parliament. There are the traditional chiefs that, as a paramount chief in a community, are in Congress. And then there is the additional house, which is elected members of a district. Much like we would have a district election here that we'll be having in a few days. There's groups of people that are in a district that are elected and also the chiefs. And so some of the things that happen is that the chiefs get involved because they are not elected to Parliament. As being a community representative, they are in Parliament. So they are not elected. However, they do get involved in the members that are elected from the districts. And so that's where the political rub is that there are, just like many countries, there are different political parties. A chief will back one party or another, which really helps, or it causes attention because people want to make sure that their chief represents all of them because they are a non-political leader in theory. But when there's the rub between who the chief supports and why, that causes a problem between both the people who are wanting to be involved in the community and supported by the chief, and also because the chief's house is supposed to be separate from the political houses that are seen, and although they're supposed to work together, there is some working together, but largely the members of Parliament are very unconnected to the actual community system. Although they are elected within a district, they tend to be very unconnected, and most of my participants couldn't tell me who their member of Parliament was and what they did to help them. So there was a real large disconnect there, and it was tough with the chiefs to be able to feel as though they were part of the government, part of the community, but also could and should connect to these members of Parliament, but that wasn't happening. The connections weren't happening between the chief and the members of Parliament, and it wasn't happening in the community, with the communities themselves as well.
I think there's a historical context to take into consideration is that chiefs in historical African past, before colonialism, there were training programs into, you were identified as a chief, and you were taken through a training program. And when colonialism came in, if the chief wasn't going in the interest of the colonial power, he was taken out. And someone who was malleable was put in.
And willing to collect the taxes and
do whatever
they needed.
So there are historical fears and valid issues where trust was broken.
Absolutely.
And it came through this power system that brought in levels of corruption and two traditional training systems that brought in this fair chief who bring in the African principles of Ubuntu.
And is that training system still intact so that it can be resurrected?
In Sierra Leone, I would say not really. It wasn't apparent through my research that there was the system in place. There was still the secession. There were still people who were identified by lineage that they could be and should be chiefs. But as far as my experience, there was not a system in place. I'm not sure if Rwanda is similar.
But Rwanda is different in terms of the political structure.
Right.
But one of the things you have to realize is Africa was divided up in around 1864. So those structures were slowly destroyed from that point on. And we're in 2010.
And the current structure looks remarkably like the structure that came in the 1800s.
From the colonial system. So part of it is breaking that down, going back to the place of storytelling and wisdom where you can actually bring back the knowledge. Because there are stories, there are books, there are audio recordings of how the old system was. And one of the things Rwanda has done, for example, the Gacaca Corpus, which was sort of what the equivalent of the Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. The Gacaca is a traditional system that was brought back in terms of how are Rwandans going to deal with the legal issues within their community. So part of it is going back, but part of it is also embracing new forms. And here at ILA, we're getting different sources, and it's about embracing the global and the local and integrating and seeing how it works and how to make it work and organically build it. There's no straightforward way of how it works.
And there's no traditional versus Western, anymore. It can't exist really in parallel. The structures exist because you have the chieftaincy structure and you have the parliamentary structure. But in all the research that's been done on traditional leadership and pairing with Western leadership, and through experience, you can't be cut and dry, black and white. We do this traditionally. We do this in a more Western style model. There's really so much of a rub between the two that I would argue that in future, as we examine more of the traditional basis of leadership and we look at it in comparison to the Western basis of leadership, we'll see that there has to be some sort of merging of the two if we're really going to do great things.
Maybe I'll just show.
Yep, sure.
Okay, so this was made, it's bilingual, so don't worry. If you're seeing something in French, the English version will come up. the end of it. This is just an example of 3 of the 30 participants who were trained. But there are a couple of things about the process that were interesting. This last part that you couldn't hear it in English, but the subtitles in French were talking about the women's issues in terms of taxation and their feeling that they were overtaxed. And so they were explaining to us that if the government really wanted them to increase their income, something has to be done in terms of how they were taxed. And so it was interesting to have this argument coming up in terms of what their issues were. And also one of the interesting things in terms of the links that happened between the students that were going into the market and the women is that after they'd taken the pictures, they went back to the market and gave the women the pictures. And for some of those women, these were the only pictures they had of themselves. So there was an excitement to the whole process in terms of engagement. And one of the things I do is I'm on the advisory council of the President of Rwanda. So some of the data and what these women tell me, I can bring back to our meetings. And one of the discussions we're having is what type of taxation system will help build Rwanda's prosperity? And how do we make it work for the micro workers in Rwanda? So this data for me that I get from talking or having our researchers be on the field talking to the women who are the poorest in Rwanda allows me to have data that would be inaccessible in other ways. So that's how I help have this data disseminated to leaders. And we hope that more research will be done to allow that to increase.
I have 2 questions. Number 1, I saw how you do it with the pictures and kind of how you present it, and you start a conversation about that. I think that's great. The question is, how do you do it with videos? It's more complex, and kind of how do you kind of, get a complete picture going on that in the village? And the second question is, in the communities we work with, we try to create the community story by basically having the different groupings, the youth, the elders, the men, each kind of prepare their own story. This way, it's an important part, you only get the women's story. Wouldn't it be important to kind of get the stories from all these different angles to get a complete picture?
I think that getting as much information is important. Funding is always an issue. In our case, it's what could we do that would have the highest impact on the community. So targeting the women, we felt, was our way of targeting, having the highest impact, what the funds were able to raise. Clearly, being able to access everybody is the best way. But also, which are the voices that are least heard? And so for us, because the women and the girls' voices are the ones that are the least heard, accessing those voices was a way of accessing one of the deepest gaps. In terms of the video, one project that I've been associated with through a colleague I'm working with who's a filmmaker is the Voices of Zambia. This was a documentary produced by women in rural Zambia on HIV/AIDS, and they produced the movie themselves and showed it to their communities and showing the issues that the girls faced in terms of when parents died and they had to leave school and went into prostitution. And what they decided is that after learning how to use camera and how to build a storyline, they decided on choosing one of the girls' stories and said, we're going to recreate your life story and we're going to put that on film. And this has gone on to amazing leaps. One of the things that happened is following this, a lot of people in the community decided to go get tested for HIV for the first time. And there was a space of destigmatization of HIV and what it was and what it represented. And also, for some of the girls who would lost their parents, they were able to show this movie to other people in their family who took property away and they were left alone and had nothing to support them. And it also showed who in the community had helped this particular young girl move forward and get back to school. And this was a teacher in the school who believed that he wanted to get all the girls off the street and back into school. And the girl was portrayed as now a woman who runs an internet cafe and who won a prize that was given to her by Warren Buffett, in terms of the leap she was able to make. And because this movie was brought into competitions and won awards. So there's a lot of ways the video work can be done and enhanced and allowed to be taken within the community and beyond the community to help more people be synthesized to issues that the community face.
And I hate to stop us, but we're past our time boundary, so I know some of you want to get going, but I'm sure we'd both be happy to stick around and chat with folks if you'd be interested. So thank you so much for coming.